G'day everyone, and a very warm welcome. My name is Robin Mellon. I'm the CEO of Better Sydney, and I'll be leading us through this webinar on prioritising your modern slavery risks. As we start today's event, I'd like to acknowledge the Bidjigal and Gadigal people who traditionally lived along the Sydney coast, where I am now, pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands wherever you're joining this webinar from across all states and territories and indeed internationally. So welcome to everyone who's joined us today to be part of this conversation. I'm very glad you could make it, and a warm hello to everyone listening to the recording after the event, as we are indeed recording this webinar for future access. It's also important to recognize here at the start the more than 40 million people around the world in conditions of modern slavery, the issue at the very heart of today's conversation. In a moment, I'll introduce the experts contributing to this webinar, and we'll hear just a couple of minutes from each of them about what they're seeing and hearing on this topic, especially given their areas of expertise, their sectors and industries. And I've asked them to provide a brief past, present and future focus. I'll then lead a bit of a discussion by posing a few questions, drawing out some of the issues that we've heard and asking each of the speakers just to outline a few more things around their expertise, their networks and the work that their organizations are doing. And then we'll be going to you, the audience, for your questions. So please, as we go, you don't have to wait till the end, please write your questions in the chat box as we go, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time provided. I may squeeze some in as we go if they're particularly on topic. Otherwise, we have space at the end to answer. So this is your chance to ask questions of the experts here. So it's a good rule. If you're wondering about an issue, it's likely that someone else is as well. Please try to keep your questions reasonably brief. No essays in the chat box, please, so we can get through them all. And we'll be wrapping up just before 10:30 a.m. So I do hope you can stay and discover more about prioritizing your human rights and modern slavery risks with us. During the webinar, you are all requested to keep your microphones on mute so that we've got the best audio quality possible. And the speakers will be talking without slides. An audio recording of the event will be made available afterwards on different websites, including the Supply Chain Sustainability School. And lastly, if you haven't already, we'd be grateful if you could let us know where you're joining us from. Maybe just a name and city or name and country, just so we can find out a bit more about our audience. So please just write the information in the chat box as we go. As I mentioned, my name is Robin Mellon. I have multiple roles, but for this webinar, I'm the CEO of Better Sydney and the project manager for the Property Council of Australia's Modern Slavery Working Group and Supplier Platform. With me, I am fortunate enough to have some of my favorite people working in this space. Delighted to welcome Nicole Thompson, the Head of Sustainable and Ethical Procurement at Edge Environment. We have Susan Mizrahi, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Australia Post. We have Justin Dillon, the CEO and founder of Freedom and Made in a Free World. And Nicole D'Souza, who is the Ethical Sourcing Manager at Konica Minolta, Australia. You can read a bit more about each of today's experts on their LinkedIn pages, which are hyperlinked from the Humanitics event page. And a very big thank you to all of the panelists and the audience for giving up your time today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and, of course, the questions. So I guess to dive into the topic and give it a little bit of context, the guidelines for reporting entities which accompany the Modern Slavery Act state very clearly, and I quote, "The risks of modern slavery practices means the potential for your entity to cause, contribute to, or be directly linked to modern slavery through its operations and supply chains. In other words, the risks that your entity may be involved in modern slavery." And it's vital to remember the next part. The concept of risk in this context means risk to people rather than risk to your entity, such as financial or reputational damage. However, often these risks to people will intersect with risks to your entity. Now, many of you will be familiar with those words, but they're useful to frame what we're going to talk about. I think most organizations of any size are familiar with risk assessment and with risk management, or they'll discuss a risk matrix at regular intervals. But here is a risk that is in many ways new to many organizations, the risk of harm to people. And with an economic downturn, with a global pandemic, with numerous sustainability concerns, it may seem difficult to prioritize. So let's hear from each of today's speakers about what they're hearing and seeing in the human rights and the modern slavery space at the moment, and particularly about some of the risks across environmental, economic, and social areas. I've asked each person, as I said, to start with just a couple of minutes to give you a snapshot of past, present, and future work. So I might turn to Nicole Thompson to start us off. Nicole, tell us what you're seeing.
Thanks, Robin. So looking into the past, I think just start off with what Edge Environment does as a business. So we're a sustainability consultancy, and really the core of our business is to help other organisations understand their risk. And so part of our expertise is around life cycle assessment and really looking at that cradle to grave, probably heard that before, and throughout the supply chain. So that's really, I guess, looking to the past, how we've come to be working in modern slavery today, because we use that same life cycle methodology to help organisations understand their risk. So coupled with the other area we work with, which is sustainability strategy and sustainable procurement. So using those strategic targets, goals, what's of value to a business, and then how that is then enacted through their governance, risk management, procurement systems is how they then go to manage those risks. So if I look at the work that we're doing with clients today in the present, and we really work with a big cross-section of clientele. So that's from property to fashion and food. We're in aged care, education, products. And we're seeing that everybody's definitely at a different stage at the moment, which I think is reassuring to a lot of people sometimes to hear that no one's quite got this figured out yet. So at the moment, we're working with clients in a bit of a mix. We're helping them understand their risk, those who are still in the early days, and more so in doing that prioritization process. So where can we have the biggest impact? And then coupling that again with that procurement process. And so we work a lot in ISO 2400 sustainable procurement and use that as a guideline to help prioritize, okay, where can we have the biggest impact as we roll out our mitigation of the risk. I might quickly touch on when we go back to like 2017, when we first started out in this, the Responsible Construction Leadership Group asked us to do a bit of a research study around the property sector's readiness for a Modern Slavery Act. In a nutshell, the readiness, they weren't ready. And one of the key recommendations out of that was around partnerships. And so fast forward to today, I think the Property Council of Australia, one of our clients, their working group on modern slavery and the supplier platform that they created, this was an awesome demonstration of that partnership. So starting from basically nothing and moving to this platform that's now out there. So I guess in terms of future, we'd like to see more of that, more of partnerships. And I think in the next couple of years, we'll really start to see more and more organisations get stuck into that due diligence aspect of risk mitigation. And I think, the best practice we're seeing is really either partnerships or where you're looking at procurement and strategy of a business holistically and how human rights fits into that and becomes a core value rather than a bit of a tack on, this is a new issue that we need to address. So, hope to see more of that in the future.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Partnership is the new leadership. So it's good to hear that in your future focus as well. Let's turn to Susan Mizrahi. I'd be delighted to hear your past, present, and future views.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to join you all today. I might just start with a little bit about myself. So I got into the field of corporate social responsibility or sustainability through a background in human rights, and was, first of all, lobbying overseas around the China-Tibet issue. Long before all the attention was focused on Xinjiang, there was a lot more focus on China with respect to Tibet, and I found myself lobbying countries about their China policy, and increasingly became concerned about human rights issues being perpetrated by companies, not just countries. And so I thought that I wanted to transition my career into the field of corporate social responsibility. And I came back to Australia about 12 years ago and led World Vision in Australia's campaign on this topic of human trafficking and child labour. It was when I first crossed paths with Justin. He was promoting his film at that time, and we were trying to increase public understanding of this issue before the establishment of Walk Free. And so I found, I focused on it for about 4 years. Fast forward, I moved into the field of corporate social responsibility and picked up a role at Australia Post about 5 years ago now. So from an Australia Post perspective, we're a household name, but not necessarily everybody understands the business from a sustainability lens. So, we're a government business enterprise. Our shareholder is the Australian government, so the government of the day. And we are legislated to turn both a profit and to provide a community service. And that attracts a workforce that is very concerned about social issues and wants to give back to the community. In 2014, before I joined Australia Post, one of our customers raised concerns about a product that prompted the business to look more carefully at its supply chain and into its supplier code of conduct, and revisited that at that time. Then when I came on board, we have since set up a group corporate responsibility plans, and we've had 2 strategies, but the second one that we launched a year ago very much focused or had an emphasis on modern slavery and a commitment to achieve greater supply chain transparency and traceability as well. So we've been doing a lot of work in the past 3 years on this topic, knowing that the legislation was on the horizon, and then since it's come into effect. We issued internally, we released a draft statement 12 months ago to give a level of comfort to the board and to senior management about what this issue was and how we're going to have to publicly report in future years. And we've literally now just finished our 2020 modern slavery statement. It goes to the board tomorrow, so fingers crossed it just gets signed off, because it has been a lot of work. So moving forward, we're really going to be delivering on some of the commitments and the aspects that we outline in that statement, and hope to get greater supply chain transparency beyond tier 1, because at this stage we don't have a consistent approach across the board.
Thanks, Susan. That's great, and it's actually really good to hear that that framing of sort of corporate social responsibility and social sustainability and human rights within that. And yes, fingers crossed for the statement going through the board.
Thank you.
Justin, let's turn to you. You're joining us today from California, so I guess you get to see more of an international perspective, but I guess an objective view of what's going on in Australia. Tell us your past, present, and future focus.
Well, first of all, Robin, thanks for having me. You're a fantastic host, by the way. I'll be honest, we've been on a lot of webinars. You're fantastic. You keep the energy going. I appreciate you having me and let me do this. I do feel like I'm connected to Australia just about every day. We have a lot of customers there. We've got a managing director there, a lot of friends there. So I do feel like it's another home for me. I've been working on this issue of forced labor for over 12 years. I got started by, as Susan mentioned, I stepped into it making a film that went around the world to help people become aware of it. That film led to some digital campaigns and some platforms that we created to create activism. That was my step into technology. Some of that technology got recognized by the Obama administration, and they asked me to help create some technology with them to help consumers understand more about forced labor. So this is in 2011, 2012. We created a website called Slavery Footprint, which can tell you how many slaves it takes to run your life. So brand agnostic, but very much connected to big data, algorithms, consumption, and essentially the very end of a supply chain, the end point of where a supply chain lives. We expected, first of all, who's going to go to a website called Slavery Footprint? That sounds like the world's largest bummer calculator. And we expected maybe 150,000 people would use the website in a year. We've reached that goal in an hour, and over 50 million people around the world know the answer to that question: how many slaves work for them? Anyone on this webinar can go learn that answer as well. It's not something you share at cocktail parties, if you remember what those are. But it was the beginning of what I believe was, for me, very much a movement. So when Slavery Footprint came out, I found myself talking at a lot of business conferences about supply chains. And at the same time, while we were pushing that, I was also doing programs where working directly rescuing kids in slavery. And I remember one particular rescue we did. I met a little boy out on a lake in Ghana named Ebenezer. And when I met his captor, I asked his captor, why is Ebenezer out here fishing all night? And he's 7 years old, he should be in school. And the man said, very, very clearly, if he doesn't work, I don't eat. And so I was in this position where I was seeing, okay, I can see it for myself. I can fly there, drive there and see it. And I can see on the other side of the supply chain, the people who want cleaner supply chains, but no one knows on these two ends what a supply chain is. And that's when I decided to connect these dots is really going to need to be a network. And I've been working on that for 8 years. And Freedom, the company that I founded, is a supply chain analysis tool. It's an app that companies use to be able to understand, mitigate risk, specifically for forced labor in their supply chains. And we built this right around the times that the laws were coming out, having no expectation that there'd be conversations like this happening around the world. It's so incredible to see what people are doing with this movement. But for us right now, it's really about getting people on the platform, getting an understanding of their risk, using big data and analytics. What we're seeing in the future is there's going to be a network effect, and we're already seeing it. And as technologists, you're always looking for behavior. You're looking for signals in the data going, where are people looking? What are the questions being asked? And what we're seeing is companies, just like Susan was saying, companies want to know what the connections are. What are the sub-tier risks? Because to your point, this is a risk against people. And if you can't figure out the commercial relationships connected to them, it's going to be hard to make an impact. So that's really where we're going as a company.
Thanks, Justin. It's really good to hear you draw in those elements of behavior and data and technology. I think we'll come back to those a bit later on because they form a really important bridge with the partnerships that Nicole and Susan were mentioning. So I think we need to get into that in a bit more detail to work out how we manage these risks. Nicole D'Souza, turning to you, tell us a bit more about your past, present, and future focus.
Sure. Thanks so much, Robin, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor, and I'm very humbled after hearing all those personal stories to be sharing the podium with Justin and Nicole and Susan and yourself. So a little bit about me, just to sort of help understand my perspective. I'm a human rights lawyer by background and regulatory lawyer, and have worked as a trade union lawyer in the cleaning industry, representing workers in wage claims and other such matters. Internationally, briefly representing the Australian government at the Human Rights Council at the UN, and in international human rights advocacy, and many years as a regulatory lawyer. So good governance and codes of conduct are sort of my lifeblood. And I think I bring all of those things together in trying to operationalize what we call human rights due diligence at Konica Minolta. So I work for the Australian subsidiary of a global multinational company, Konica Minolta Inc., which is a manufacturer of print devices, office technology, and other health equipment. Here in Australia, Konica Minolta Business Solutions Australia is the distributor of our parent company manufactured product, as well as third-party products such as robotic process automation, 3D printing, and software solutions and enterprise content management. So it's quite a broad area of B2B support that we provide. And our customers in Australia are everything from government to not-for-profit organisations, schools, small businesses, local government, councils, and very large corporate and enterprise customers as well. So Konica Minolta in Australia, as I said, our global parent company is a different entity, but they started on this responsible sourcing journey some years ago and have a fairly well-established responsible sourcing program partnered with the Responsible Business Alliance. And back in 2015, Konica Minolta in Australia, then led by Dr. David Cook as our managing director, went on a journey, I think, of awareness, which led to the establishment of the local ethical sourcing program, which I'm now the incumbent position lead on. And really that came about from a little bit like Justin's story, connecting the dots between the suffering of people that we don't see and have no direct exposure to, and a moment of awakening where the people who, sell print technology in our business said, wow, we'll never forget what we've seen or heard, and what can we do, and how does this relate to our own operations? And so what had happened there, I won't tell the whole story in detail, but what had happened there is, as an organization that goes on multiple conferences, previously they involved planes and trips to interesting places in the world. One of those trips was in Thailand, and it was there that my colleagues came into contact with stories about the horrors of slavery in the Thai fishing industry. They were actually on a boat at the time and heard about vessels in the surrounding waters that had slaves on them and people being sold for cash dollar amounts. And that was a really shocking realization that a human being in this day and age, this is 5 years ago that this occurred, that human beings in this day and age are still being bought and sold and are not free to leave and can be bound to do something at somebody else's bidding. And so fast forward to where we are now, Konica Minolta launched its ethical sourcing roadmap and decided to make that open source to really invite other businesses to go on the same journey of asking themselves how human rights might be negatively impacted in their own direct operations and supply chains. And like most businesses that are scratching their heads now, Konica Minolta also was asking those questions and continues to ask those questions about what do we do? Now that we know about this problem, what's the solution? So we very quickly realized that collaboration was at the heart of action, and we became an advocate. Our business became an advocate for action to address modern slavery, and joined in a coalition with other businesses, civil society organisations, a very broad cross-section, calling for a level playing field to be introduced in Australia, which eventually led to the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act. Konica Minolta is now a reporting entity under that act, and as a Japanese parent company, we have a Japanese financial year. And so we have just submitted on the 30th of September our first modern slavery statement as a reporting entity under that act. So that document will be available publicly very shortly. And so I invite everyone to feel free to review that statement. And it's an ongoing journey. We certainly do not have all of the answers. We have not solved all of the problems. And I think it's really important to realize that as you go on a journey of awareness and action, you can only continue to be aware of what you must do next, and you must continue to move forward with that. So currently, we are developing our new CSR strategy. Our current CSR strategy, 2017 to 2020, included 5 pillars, one of which was human rights and ethical sourcing. And we're currently developing our next strategy to 2025, which will include, again, a pillar on human rights and ethical sourcing. So this focus that we have had in the past as part of our corporate social responsibility will very much continue into the future, but it is a cross-functional, integrated part of how we do business, and we are constantly seeking to integrate that into all other parts and areas of our engagement. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great, and it's also genuinely encouraging to hear that. To use Maya Angelou's words, that once you know better, you need to do better. That constant improvement, that continuous improvement referenced in the Act, actually playing out in organisations like Konica Minolta. I guess just to wrap these introductions up, from my past, present, and future perspective, we do seem to be starting off from quite a low base, as Nicole Thompson was saying, with quite a generally low level of knowledge, not just about what modern slavery means, but where modern slavery and human rights abuses might be occurring through organizations' operations and their supply chains. Despite the best efforts of organizations like the Supply Chain Sustainability School, Anti-Slavery Australia, Be Slavery Free, and initiatives like the calculator that Justin mentioned. And that, of course, is what makes it harder to assess and address the risks of harm to people. There are a number of great initiatives. Nicole Thompson mentioned the Property Council of Australia's supplier platform, which has been going for just over a year now, and is seeking to look at much more of an educational, collaborative approach to assessing and improving supply chain data. So trying to encourage continuous improvement throughout the supply chain and leading people to, I guess, current and relevant and accessible free resources. And the future is particularly hard to map at the moment, but I think, as Justin said, the increasing use of technology, of platforms, of systems is not just going to improve transparency, it's going to help us evaluate the risks and look at them to see where collaboration can achieve so much more than just working alone. And so which risk areas will need a sector-wide approach or industry-specific resources. And I think with that increased supply chain visibility comes the knowledge that our supply chains, and those are the panelists and all the attendees, they're all interdependent and intertwined. And so they're very much dependent on each other's success. But what I'd like to do now is go from speaker to speaker and just tease out some of the issues around modern slavery risks, draw on what we've said so far and understand a bit more about their different approaches. I may start, Susan and Nicole D'Souza, I may start really with a foundational question. You're with two quite different organizations, but are you seeing the language of human rights being used more in everyday corporate practice? Is the topic becoming, I won't say normalized, but at least demystified to help you with those priorities? Nicole, I might throw to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Robin. I think it's a really important issue, and it's the reason I planted that phrase human rights due diligence in my introductory section. I've kind of made it my mission now to demystify that term as much as I possibly can, because I really believe it's at the heart of what we're being asked to do as organisations responding to modern slavery risk. It's about applying a human rights lens to the way that organisations conduct their operations and their business. And that language does need to be demystified. I was very enthusiastic 2 years ago when I first came to Konica Minolta about educating everybody about the Universal Declaration and the International Bill of Rights and using terminology that you could see the shutters come down on people's eyes. And actually, it's not about that necessarily. I think it's more about unpacking what the real world implications of those things are and how they are relevant to each person in their role and what their capacity for influence and action to create a better world is. And actually, that's a really empowering thing once we realize that. Every procurement person is a potential human rights hero. Wow. And so for me, it's actually about that. It's actually about connecting the dots between what's being asked at the global level of us through the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which creates effectively an obligation for all businesses to respect human rights in their operations and supply chains. But what does that mean for every business in practice, from a small business through to a multinational? And that's where the policies and practices and processes and the understanding the why, connecting people with these new policies and processes so that it doesn't just become dry regulatory ticker box stuff, but actually we can say we are aligning ourselves with international human rights by adding this new tick box to our supply form, because we now know something we didn't know before. And that's, I think, where the demystification can happen.
Thanks. We'll come back to the why later, because I think that's, as Justin was saying, that's one of the most important elements. Susan, tell us a bit more. Are you seeing the language of human rights being used a bit more? Are you seeing that unfolding in your work?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that as a sustainability manager, it's an evolving discipline, and so increasingly you see different pieces of terminology, or different terminology, different tools, different approaches being introduced. And I think that Australia, in many ways, is a few steps behind globally in relation to all the sustainability issues as a whole. And I think in relation to human rights in particular, this is the case. I couldn't agree more with Nicole's comment that human rights needs to be demystified. But I think it's I don't know, I'd be interested in Justin's perspective on this, but I think it's a particularly challenging issue in the Australian context. I've worked in Europe and I've worked in the US, and I don't see the language of human rights being something that people cringe about in the same way as they do here. So from a materiality perspective, we annually survey our key stakeholders, whether it be our workforce, our customers, management board, etc. Suppliers, and ask them what they think are the most important issues for Australia Post to be addressing each year. We've been following a similar approach for 5 years, but whenever we put the language human rights in there, no one ever thinks it's an issue. Like, it never comes up as one of the priority issues that we should be addressing as a company. And all of that with the backdrop that Australia Post was Australia's first equal opportunity employer. In 1988, we had an Indigenous employment strategy years before the concept of a reconciliation action plan was invented. We have had gender pay parity for 4 consecutive years. We have very strong workplace employment practices. Now, all of those things are different human rights matters, touch on different human rights matters. And when we survey through materiality around those topics, they're all deemed to be very high. Safety, of course, is our number one priority, right? Because we have people on the roads every day. And so I personally, in my current role, do not see the term human rights being used more and more. But in my role, in my organisation, but if I look at the discipline of sustainability and the tools and the conversations that are happening, particularly abroad, yes, it is an area that's increasingly being discussed, but I think there's a long way for businesses to go to have a greater level of comfort talking about human rights.
Thank you. I might take your words and paraphrase slightly. Justin, are you seeing, I won't say the cultural cringe, but are you seeing that cringe factor around human rights? Are you seeing a sort of a hesitation in Australia?
No, because those people wouldn't talk to me. I mean, by the time you get to our company, you're not cringing about that. And the same thing goes here in the States and elsewhere. I mean, we've got customers in Europe and Canada and here in the States. Everyone has, for instance, in Canada, they don't want to use human trafficking. They want to use, I might get it wrong. The States likes human trafficking. It doesn't like modern slavery for obvious reasons. Everyone's got their own kind of trigger words around this issue. To me, they all, child labor, worst forms of child labor, ILO, all the rest of it. It's like, yeah, people are being exploited. We can put that all in a bucket and try to fix that.
So what are your clients asking you about prioritizing risks? What are they? What are the main things that people are coming to you concerned about at the moment?
Well, I can tell you the clients that don't spend a lot of time with us, meaning don't jump on our platforms, are more the kind of tick box compliance driven. Let's just file it on a folder and put it over here. No judgment, but what a wasted opportunity, I think, to be a part of something so important. And I say that both as a CEO and as a movement builder. We run our company like a movement. We have a movement mentality. We give away parts of our income in order to help fund programs, and so we're in it, it's all the feels and all the dollars all at the same time. But so again, our view and the people who do get close to us, the companies that are working with us really care. Like, to the point where we get a little embarrassed that we're not doing enough as a technology to dig into the problems, because technology, does have its limitations, and we get up every day trying to figure out how to give the tools to our customers to make more of an impact. And I hear the word impact far more than I hear the word compliance with our customers.
Mm-hmm. If I can just jump back in there, I don't think, I just want to be clear that I don't think it's so much that Australia Post doesn't care. It's more the language or the terminology of human rights that I don't feel is necessarily useful in our organisation and helps with getting traction. But certainly, yes, the proof points that I spoke to illustrate that it is an area of importance to the company.
And Susan, I think that's replicated across different sectors and different organizations, whether they're, government or non-government, depending on size or sector, that the language, and as Justin was saying, the particular use of, leaning towards some terms or away from others, you'll see that across sectors.
Can I
Nicole?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting discussion. And just to share some insights, we also, like Susan, have recently been on a materiality assessment journey. And it's interesting because Konica Minolta is an organisation that's very vocal about our commitment to and respect for human rights. And that has been reflected incredibly strongly in the assessment of our stakeholders. So internally, our employees recognise the significance and continue to indicate that it is important for Konica Minolta to take action on human rights and advocacy and ethical sourcing and modern slavery. And externally, the small sample size, admittedly, of our external stakeholders that we engaged with as part of our materiality assessment also provided a similar high prioritization in that area. So, and we have also recently conducted a kind of analysis of our major bids and tenders and customers, and there has been a very significant increase in the sorts of questions that are coming, and we knew that anecdotally, but we now have that internal evidence to demonstrate that customers, government, and major enterprise are asking much more incisive questions, and the types of questions they're asking align to international human rights and labour organisation standards. So there is a very clear correlation between international human rights and where this sector is going. And if we look at what's happening in Europe with the development of potential mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, that is a major, major shift. And what that means is international businesses that operate in Australia will be changing their policies and programs and practices to align with legislation in other parts of the globe where they operate, which will have a cascading influence on their operations in Australia. So I think we should see the tide coming.
I hope so. I really hope so.
I always remain optimistic, Robin.
Good. I may come back to you when I need a bit more optimism one day. Nicole Thompson, tell us what you're seeing, I guess, about how your clients are asking you about prioritizing risk, but also, this cascade that Nicole D'Souza was mentioning. Are you seeing this as well across different sectors?
Yeah, there's definitely. I think we've definitely got clients feeling the, pressure as well. A lot of those clients that we're seeing, if you put them in the leading kind of bucket as opposed to the tick box exercise, I think they're really feeling it isn't from the legislation, but more so from, say, investors or advocacy groups, or they've got someone dedicated, such as Susan or Nicole or Justin, within their organisation who understands that this is an important issue and they're advocating for that internally. I think what we're hearing in terms of prioritization from clients, it's really overwhelming, and as everyone's touched on, there's all these competing priorities, and so it's not that it's not important to them, it's just that how do we find our way, and how do we pick which category or which supplier to focus on. And so I think this is where that kind of hotspot analysis and supply chain understanding really comes from, is to work on, where can we have the most influence or I guess impact. And really going through each category of supplier and picking either environmental or social priorities, and then communicating that throughout your supply and procurement teams. And like Nicole said, everybody has this role. Everybody can be a hero in human rights. It's really just educating and empowering them to do so. Yeah.
Thank you. I might just turn back. Nicole D'Souza, something you said earlier, I I think there's a lot of focus in the Modern Slavery Act on sort of the first few criteria around, essentially what are your risks and what are you doing about them. I think there's been a little bit of a gap around how do you assess the effectiveness of what you're doing. Do you have any words of wisdom? So tell us a little bit about your approach, but how can organizations assess the effectiveness of what they're doing?
Yeah, look, I think from my perspective, that's definitely the most challenging aspect of the legislation, because what we're being asked to do is address a really complex global problem that so far governments and the civil society sector that have been working for decades on it haven't been able to resolve to finality. So business is now another player as part of that. So I think it's really important to recognize the long game and recognize that there is long-term commitment and resource allocation and a shifted time lens that you apply to taking action and addressing this issue. So how are we doing that at Konica Minolta? You can read about it in detail in our modern slavery statement, but a few tips. We've established a modern slavery working group, a cross-functional working group across our organisation, and that is to hold our program to account, to bring all parts of our business really squarely into the frame and to drive that implementation and embeddedness within our organisation, and to sort of be an opportunity for continuous improvement with a key group of core internal stakeholders. So that's one area. The other area is, as I've mentioned, we're a B2B, and that means that our customers are coming to us as a supplier with their own reporting obligations. So where our customers are, business entities that have a consolidated revenue of more than 100 million Australian dollars per year, then they have their own mandatory reporting obligations as well. And so, as I said, we are seeing a real upswing in the level of detail coming through in some of those questions. And we use those as learning opportunities. They're not just a compliance obligation for us. That's an opportunity for introspection and reflection and referral to the Modern Slavery Working Group. The other area is that we have recently worked on a project to develop a reporting framework, which I hope will be a baseline for future years' reporting. And we developed that with international human rights standards and best practice from the sector, looking at human rights benchmarking and labour organisation benchmarking and multi-stakeholder initiatives, and trying to distill that into a meaningful 1- and 2-step framework that we could apply for our own operations using the data available to us. And the idea is to create a baseline so that in years to come, we will be able to track some form of improvement, even if it's against 1 or 2 data points. So I think there's a number of levels at which you have to assess effectiveness. The first one is, why are you doing this? And how do your actions reflect or contribute to why you're doing what you're doing? And I think that's absolutely at the core of absolutely everything. We're not doing this simply to be able to have something to report. We're moving this to hopefully shift the dial. And that might be engaging in webinars like this, where we are hopefully influencing other businesses to think differently or take action. And that selfishly contributes to better engagement across the business world, because all businesses are then moving, all ships are moving in the same direction.
You mentioned you've got the Modern Slavery Working Group up and running, and actually that seems to be a common theme amongst some of the leaders. They're providing a sort of a cross-disciplinary, multi-team working group. And as you said, they're looking for opportunities for continuous improvement. It's not a complaints process. It's positive. But you mentioned shifting the time frame and playing a longer game. What are you, 5 years, 10 years? What are you looking at there roughly?
Yeah. I mean, look, our next CSR strategy, as I said, will be a 5-year strategy. So that's certainly a time frame. But I mean, for Konica Minolta as an organisation, I think when you get to the 5 and 10 year point, it's really beyond just Konica Minolta. What we're talking about is, once we get beyond tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 of our supply chain, and we're operating at that level, you've got to be looking then at collaborative action. You've got to be looking at, how is business feeding back to government, feeding back into legislative processes, or, we've got a 3-year review period for the modern slavery legislation, for example. It's then, effectiveness of your actions might be advocacy to address the problems that you haven't been able to address by directly engaging with your supply chain, or once you've identified those risk areas and you have limited capacity for influence, what is going to shift the dial? So I think, effectiveness of actions really comes back to what are you trying to achieve and what is it that needs to change? And what we're trying to achieve and what we need to change will change depending on the time frame that you apply.
Thank you. Thank you. I might just building on that, Susan. I say this without trying to be ingratiating, but Australia Post is recognised in procurement circles as being leaders around social procurement, social value, around Indigenous procurement. That is again a long-term game, as Nicole was just saying. But how has this come about? How have you managed to achieve that change? But also, how has that helped advance your work around modern slavery and human rights?
Sure. So Australia Post, being a community-oriented organisation, means that some sort of initiatives that sometimes might be challenging or obscure to other businesses just is automatic for Post. And I think the area of social and Indigenous procurement is one of those. So we, have a presence in every community around Australia. We're often the heart of those, particularly remote and regional communities. And also our product is required. We're required to perform a product at a uniform rate to ensure inclusivity, so that no one is left behind. So this concept of inclusion and fairness is sort of a core to our purpose as well, in a very deep way, not in sort of like spin that we have on our website, and it drives the thinking and the culture of the organisation. And so some years ago, when Supply Nation was established and some of these other entities, social traders obviously, it was really quite logical for us to start looking at our procurement practices and seeing how we can purchase in a way that has positive benefits for Indigenous businesses, for Australian disability enterprises, and for other social enterprises. And we've gone about, for the first few years, I think it was a capacity building thing, and getting procurement teams to understand that there was opportunity to focus beyond delivering on time and at a cost, and that they had the power and opportunity to create additional forms of value through their everyday practices. And so we were able to work with the procurement team over years around that. And actually, I think also some of this work, I really strongly feel, comes down to just having great people. And we've had a couple of really great people in our team that have somebody, as Robin Roach, for example, was in the procurement team as a young procurement personnel, and then she moved across into sustainability because of this issue and was so passionate. So that experience working with the procurement team on issues that were beyond delivering on time and a certain cost, and getting them to think about social issues, has created bridges with that team and created a conversation that I think we've been able to build on and leverage further with respect to modern slavery. Also, I worked with that team about 3 years ago on setting up a set of sustainable procurement principles. And one of them was to prioritise purchasing from social, Indigenous and ethically certified organisations. And the other one was to not use exploitative or forced labour practices, and to ensure that we had fair wages as well. So those sets of principles, I think, were used to support training and was a focus point of training, I guess, with the procurement team as well over many years, and that we've been able to build on that further with the conversation around modern slavery.
Thank you. Justin, I'm going to turn to you. Gloves off. Since we're talking about procurement, the Deloitte's survey, which they did of global chief procurement officers, I think before the Modern Slavery Act came out, reported that 65% of global procurement leaders said that they had limited or no visibility beyond their tier one or their immediate suppliers. If that's the case, how can reporting entities, how can big organizations around Australia actually even know, let alone manage their risks properly?
It's true. I think that is really about first tier. I think very, very few companies, I would argue it's closer to the single digit percentages, have an understanding beyond tier one. Those are usually apparel or CPG. So it is very difficult to understand where risk beyond tier one. And in fact, that's most likely where risk is happening. But you have to take baby steps. And sometimes we forget to celebrate the pretty good and while we're waiting to celebrate the perfect, which never comes. And so part of this is building a process over time. And so, the way that we approach it is, and the way that we celebrate with our customers is, it's really important to understand your first tier suppliers and understand that you are a company based not just of value, but of values. And those showing up through the procurement process, quite frankly, is going to mean a whole lot more. Not just because you got an SAQ from a company that matters, but also that it comes up during a sourcing event, and understanding and getting better, understanding where your first tier suppliers are. But really, what you want to be understanding is what your first tier suppliers are doing, what their first tier suppliers are doing, right? Getting an understanding of that. And that is really mattering here in the US. In fact, just this week, for the first time ever, Customs and Border Patrol actually got a conviction on a company that was importing sweetener here to the US. And in a lot of ways, it's a shot across the bow around a 1930 Tariff Act that banned the importation of slave-made goods. Back in the 30s, it allowed for, unless we could make it here in America. So basically, you could make whatever you want with slavery in America if you couldn't be made somewhere else. But Obama closed that off. And then in this administration, they've been enforcing it. And this is coming down to sanctioning suppliers and cotton suppliers in China, northern China, elsewhere. Those are usually second or third tier suppliers. And companies are kind of found flat-footed, understandably so, when you've never been asked to do that before. That's not a job as a procurement person or sustainability person you've been asked to do. So the only real way to get that, especially in a time of COVID where there are no auditors showing up at factories, is using big data and analysis. And I keep hearing about action and impact, but there really is a gestation of being able to get insights, take action, and then you see impact. And those don't all come at once. And usually they come in very short bursts with an SAQ or getting a better understanding of the data that goes into your supplier network. So it's really important to understand that this is something that grows over time. It's not going to happen in one reporting period. And that's why there's multiple reporting periods for this issue, because the government understands, just to what I understand, that this is something that's going to have to get better over time. So companies getting into their second and third year reporting are going to need to start thinking about, how do we get better visibility and understand what risk looks like and what impact looks like as they go forward.
So we've heard, from Susan and yourself about the importance of having a great team and about the people. And I saw David had just repeated that great quote. You're not just a company of value, but values. Thanks, David. It's great to have that clarified again. But Justin, what is the role of big data? Big data and predictive analysis and the technology. You've mentioned it, but how are we going to genuinely use it to take these big leaps forward?
Big data means nothing without analysis. You have to have a way to be able to crunch and synthesize big data. The good news is there's enough big data out there where you can start to understand risk beyond tier one. That's very possible. There's ways. We're starting to do this for some of our customers where we're getting them insights. We call them trading partners, where we can help our customers just by telling us their suppliers. We have ways in which we can help them understand their suppliers. That's kind of cool, because now you can, what I heard when I first started going to supply chain conferences is, we've got all the responsibility, but none of the power. We can't see our whole supply chain. Well, it's better now. I can't tell you where your cobalt comes from, but we could probably get to your second or third tier supplier. So big data means nothing without some type of analysis. And analysis leads to the insights, right? So what the insights are what gets shared to the wonderful people inside the company. How do we want to act on this? What does this look like? What's our policy? Do we cut and run? Do we put them on probation? That's where it gets real, and that's where you start to see the impact. So big data comes first, but it's just a big bowl of spaghetti without some kind of spoon to start pulling it out and give you something to eat with.
Okay, so Nicole Thompson, we've heard about the role of big data, and I know I've heard this, but I'm sure you've got clients coming to you and saying, "Look, we've rolled out a supplier questionnaire, we've sent it to our high-risk suppliers. Is that enough? Do we need to do more than that? Where do we go from here?"
Yeah, supplier questionnaires would definitely finding you kind of everybody's go-to in terms of due diligence, which makes sense. It's what everybody's normally rolling out and using for your quality and safety and everything. But I think, a supplier questionnaire is really only as good as the procurement process in place or the people behind it to manage that. And as Justin just said, you need that analysis behind it. So if you're not using tech and you're relying on your sourcing or project managers or procurement managers to roll out a supplier questionnaire, with that really needs to be, a whole heap of other support. And so that's, starting with upskilling and providing them with knowledge so that those managers have the confidence to be able to have those conversations with suppliers. So if someone's not performing on a supplier questionnaire, they can go back and say, hey, what's going on? I think as well, or around that, rather than just rolling out questions, you need to set what does a good response look like. So is there a methodology and is there an understanding of what's acceptable? So what's an organization's risk appetite? And the red flag. So training up people to be able to say, okay, there's something not right here, and know what questions to ask. I think as well, so we hear time and time again, resources. No one has resources to do this. There's another 20 questions that we need to ask our suppliers. And so I think it's super important for, if this is of real value, if human rights and modern slavery is of real value and importance to an organisation, hear that from the top down, and just say, yes, you've got permission to spend time on this or budget or resources to do so. Spend the time on doing those due diligence and have those conversations with suppliers. I think that supplier questionnaires are all about creating that two-way conversation. It's not just that let's get them to check a box that they have a policy. It's definitely part of it, but I think if rolling out questionnaires, starting the conversation, asking where do you need support and where may we have those shared risks and we can work together. That's the real purpose of a supplier questionnaire.
Thank you. I think that two-way conversation is particularly important. It's not just a one-way flow of information and now what do we do with it? How do we analyze it? But how can we work with our suppliers and through our supply chains on improving things over time? I should probably drop a last question in before we turn to the audience. I've seen there's a few questions already coming through, so please get those through now. I think it's important to I may ask Nicole D'Souza and Justin this, but the challenges that COVID-19 has thrown up when it comes to modern slavery risks and organizational priorities, because I think now, I won't say more than ever, but now it is particularly hard to keep social issues at the forefront of conversations when with an economic downturn arriving. What are the challenges and how do we overcome these? Nicole, I might go to you first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Robin. Look, it's been, I think, the number one human rights issue for businesses to address this year. And so there's that human rights approach, which is to be concerned about the welfare of people in your business and your supply chains, and introducing that, as Susan was saying before, as a additional consideration, in addition to price and quality and speed of delivery, as was often the case in the COVID environment, which is to say that you need to reinforce the importance of human rights or social sustainability, whatever language you're using. Now is not the time for us to be dropping the ball on our focus and commitment to human rights. If anything, it's more important than ever. And I think when you apply the modern slavery in the time of COVID lens, we all now know there's very, very clear evidence of high levels of modern slavery risk associated with the production of personal protective equipment, which every organisation is sourcing to protect their employees, and some sectors more so than others. So what does that mean in practice? It means informing yourself, informing your organisation, and recognizing that risk is a constantly shifting metric, and that we need to have sources of information that provide that intelligence. So Konica Minolta works with Freedom, for example, and we have real-time media alerts of risk. We have access through the UN Global Compact Network Australia that we're a member of. We participate in their modern slavery community of practice. We have, globally recognized sources of information, access to webinars, expert guidance that we can quickly draw from and distill, and then look to integrate into our supply chain. So, going back to the kind of broader commitments to human rights, another area that Konica Minolta is committed to is Indigenous procurement, and we aim to launch our first reconciliation action plan very soon. But we're also a member of Supply Nation. So in the short term, we were able to, working with our procurement teams, to redirect spend towards Indigenous businesses for the sourcing of our personal protective equipment. And that's something that is an ongoing, I think, piece of engagement with suppliers to understand what their level of visibility is in that area.
Thanks for that, Justin. How can organizations try and keep social issues at the forefront of conversations, especially during a pandemic?
Because it's getting worse, and about 20 years of gains around reducing child labor have been lost in 6 months. Poverty, slavery is essentially poverty with the bottom dropped out of it, right? And so we're seeing, and we're going to continue to see, increased extreme poverty, which it creates, extreme vulnerability. This is going to affect every business in the world. And just like businesses are learning to retool their sales and retool their supply chains and retool their marketing, we have to retool our oversight. I believe that in times of survival, I believe that innovation is just survival with a cooler name. It's a way in which you learn how to do something you have to do and do it better. And I don't prescribe to the idea that addressing forced labor and supply chains is a nice to have or a should do. I just think it's much bigger than that. And I believe that because we're how many months into COVID and we're still talking about it, and there's still more and more issues around this. It's not going away because of the pandemic.
So what does retooler oversight mean?
You already talked about it. Using big data, not relying or empowering audits to do far more than just check boxes. We've got to do a lot more and think a lot. Use the tools at hand, the same tools that we use to be able to find customers and to serve customers. We need to find and use to be able to serve people in our supply chains. And those tools are available. It's just one of the spaces. Oversight and supply chains is a cost center, so it's not going to get all the cool toys as quick as anything else. That's just the way it is. That's all right. But that just means you just got to do it smarter and better. And so that's part of what we try to do. But there's lots of ways in which you can do it. You just have to. But the beginning is you have to be willing to think different about how you do these things.
We had a question earlier on, Justin, just to close this one off. How do you recommend that we approach suppliers to assist them in building an ethical workforce? Any suggestions there?
Yeah, come as a helper. So come with information about how to help them. Do not come as a buyer with a waving finger. Come as did you know? How about this? Have you tried this? Don't just take a questionnaire, look for ways in which the gaps that they're missing and ways that you can help them. I just think this top-down approach isn't gonna work. Only a network is gonna be built upon people around companies working together. And there's a great one of the if I can say this, when I ran a nonprofit, one of our primary funders was Pierre Midyar, who started eBay. And we had a few rare opportunities. We didn't spend a lot of time with him, but we'd ever so often we go to cocktail parties. And I remember him sharing one time, he said, when we started eBay, 98 or 99, I don't know what that was. He's like, people were so afraid of the internet. But we just had this belief, much less do commerce on the internet. But the people at eBay had this belief that people are basically good. And they just need opportunities to demonstrate their trust to each other. And that's what that built. We wouldn't have an Uber or an Airbnb without an eBay, right? And I actually believe supply chains are the same way. People are basically good. They just need a network in which they can demonstrate their trust with one another. And that's how I have to think about it.
That's a really good point. Thank you for that. We've got a number of questions rolling in, so I may just move on. We may sort of ask for briefer answers. Actually, Nicole, there's a question here essentially about how we move from checking boxes from the compliance approach to actionable and realistic topics. If surveys and assessments aren't necessarily, giving a fair view, how do we move from that checkbox approach onwards? Nicole Thompson, sorry, I should have directed that one a bit better.
Sorry. It's really about that. That comes back to the values. How do we make human rights core to business, and comes back to that same language about how do we make this important. So a materiality assessment, ask your stakeholders, for example, as Nicole D'Souza has done. It's an easier sell, I guess, than sustainability environmental issues, because we're talking about real people in our supply chains here. And so as soon as you start to have conversations internally as well as externally, and make that connection to people, I think the importance of this starts to rise up. Yeah.
Thank you. Nicole D'Souza and Susan, there's a question here which I think goes back to our earlier conversation. The discussion about the language we use and what triggers people in different cultures makes me wonder how we work on our biases about slavery and human rights, like we do for gender and race bias. Any good examples of this? Any good example of these biases and how we improve these over time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think if you were to adopt a human rights-based approach, as we try and do at Konica Minolta, you need to be looking at human beings as empowered individuals that are capable of self-determination. And so recognizing, for example, that much of slavery intersects with migrant workers and labor exploitation. So, you look at the flows of people that I'm meant to be giving a short answer, so I'm going to stop now. But I think, if you take that human rights-based approach, you realize that there are multiple drivers that lead a person to seek employment, to seek opportunity, to seek livelihood, to seek happiness. And equally so, there are drivers and geopolitical factors that overlay gender. So I think it's 71% of people who are enslaved are women and girls. So there's a very, very strong gender bias against women in enslavement. And race Susan, is a huge factor, I think, with Australia's history, the history of Indigenous enslavement and unpaid wages in Australia is part of that history as well.
I'm sure that Justin could share a lot on that particular point coming from the US. But one of the issues that I see, one of the comments that I see that grates with me, I have to say, is the viewpoint that, well, if children are not working, then the family's not getting food. And I think it's really important to draw the distinction between child work and child labor or child exploitation. Children can go to work and children can go to school and also be able to support their family with providing a supplementary income and food on the table. But it really disturbs me when colleagues, not necessarily at Australia Post, but over time, have sort of made the point, well, there's poor countries in Asia or poor countries in Africa, the children need to work. Actually, the children need to have the opportunity to be educated so that they can be moved beyond this cycle of poverty and inequality and injustice. And I think that's a bias that needs to be stamped out.
Thank you. There's a really good question here, which, again, I find personally important. But I guess Justin and Nicole Thompson, what's the most impactful way we can engage our staff when rolling out training around modern slavery, especially around human trafficking? Some people may feel so removed from this or not see the direct relevance of this to day-to-day roles. Any good suggestions around impact and training? Justin, let's go to you first.
Yeah, I think it's oftentimes when I tell people who our customers are, they'll go, "Oh wait, that's a services industry. They don't have a supply chain." And I think that if you come at it through the lens of come at it through the lens of responsibility, and talk to, in terms of training, in terms of talking to folks inside the company, start with the question of what is our responsibility as a company to not just ourselves, but to those we do business with. And where does that responsibility end? Of course, it can't be endless, but I think it is an opening statement or opening question to say, does our responsibility just end with our own employees? Does it end with our customers? Does it actually involve our supply chain? Okay, great. If it involves our supply chain, how are we making sure that our values are being protected? Do we want those values to be protected just with our suppliers? Or are we receiving benefit as a company, whether through indirect or direct spend, beyond just those suppliers? And I think those are concepts that it's okay to not understand out of the gate. Most people don't, but increasingly more are. And having an understanding to not just see responsibility as a burden, but as an opportunity for a company to be able to express its values. Because the great thing about using procurement to change the world is you were going to spend that money anyway.
Yeah. And Nicole Thompson, any pointers around training, and in particular, just to link to another question, empowering people in the training, so empowering them to address the situation, not just improve levels of knowledge?
Yeah, it's exactly that. A mix of giving responsibility, just touched on before, is if you've got procurement managers, project managers, sourcing managers who are responsible for this now, empowering them, seeing that this is a company value, but it can be your value as well. And I guess giving them that chance to see that they can have an impact through their work. Every role in an organization, whether it's HR or legal or recruitment or whatever, has some role to play in terms of mitigating modern slavery, because it's the organization as a whole and the way that they do business which is impacting the supply chain. So in terms of training, practically what can you do? We see the comment coming through that yes, we've done a 30-minute webinar or something like that, and I think that's, in terms of due diligence actions, a lot of companies are doing that little tick box. Yeah, we've done a presentation on modern slavery, we've trained our employees. Look at training for what does each team need. So legal will need something different from sourcing, just like HR will, etc. So make sure the training is tailored for that audience. Maybe you want to start with a wide, broader, what is modern slavery, but then drill it down into what does this mean for your role personally, and what are the actions you can take in your business's responsibilities. So it's definitely long game, like anything. Start with training, drill down to specific modules. There's so many resources out there, and I think that those working groups as well are really important as part of training, to understand where are the gaps and continue to fill them.
I may add to that, having been involved in a number of these sort of training modules and resources, but the three questions you really want to set out with are: what do you want people to know? Be really clear. What do you want people to do? And that could be about empowering them or taking action if they see something. But what do you want people to change? And that goes back to the procurement issues or the organizational culture. What do you want them to change over time? And yes, that can be a long game, but it's really important to be clear about how and what you want them to change. There's a question here which it says maybe a bit left of field, but is actually really interesting, about whether the increased legislation and scrutiny on supply chains may see companies de-risking by re-onshoring work or buying more things locally. So bringing things back to within, I won't say within Australia because we have an international audience, but within the country. Do you think this will have impacts further down the supply chains in, say, developing countries? Justin, any thoughts on this one about re-onshoring and about moving risks around?
Sounds great in an election year. I mean, I think that ship has sailed. I just don't see it. Let me be clear. I've never run a supply chain, and I think it's ambitious. I don't think modern slavery acts are enough to do that. I think obviously there's going to be other factors, and I think look, sometimes trade wars are a great way to be able to get human rights work done. I don't care. We'll jump on top of that and try to get, there was a, here in the U.S. between us and Mexico and Canada, there was the NAFTA trade agreement has been reprovisioned, recreated, renamed, new acronym that we all have to learn, and added inside of it is the banning of importation of slave-made goods. So that's not a modern slavery act. It's a trade enforcement act, and it's being taken very seriously, very seriously. So I don't know about how. I think we can do more by using what we've got and using our dollars being spread around the world to be able to make change around that. And to me, that's probably the best plan that we could execute against.
There's a question here which I may answer directly. Where can we get practical information to identify hotspots? And is the Property Council database launched and available for use by others? I think there's a lot of great information out there. And yes, you can go to different websites, the Social Hotspots databases. There are teams with whom you can work, people like Freedom, that look at particular risks in a lot more depth. The Property Council supplier platform is available. It was launched in October last year, and it's gone through the pilot phase. You can download the question set, so you can have a look at the assessment questions. It was always designed to be something that was transparent and something that would evolve with the legislation. And so, the questions will change. The free resources and learning modules that are linked from it will also change in time. And I'll provide a link in the chat box and in the follow-up email that we send around after this event. There is a cracker of a question here. Nicole D'Souza and Susan, I'm going to bowl this your way because I think it's much more sort of organizational. But do we need to acknowledge that in many cases we will need to pay more and wait longer for slavery-free products and services? And if so, how do we make this case with our stakeholders? Nicole, are we going to need to pay more and wait longer, or is this just the cost of our social license to operate?
Yeah, look, I think you have to reverse the question, in the words of our managing director, and ask yourself, who's paying the cost? You may not be paying the cost, but somebody's paying it with their life. And once you know that, you don't ask that question. And so it really comes back to the why we're on this journey, and if you do have genuine organizational commitment. And it's so important to bring everyone from top to bottom of your organization on that journey, and use whatever driver you need to. We've got legislation in Australia. Some people will respond, some boards, some organizations will respond to the compliance angle. And so the compliance angle is not one to be diminished. I think it's a very important sword. And if that's what gets you across the line, well, this is no longer socially acceptable. It's contrary to the social license to operate. Well and good. And yeah, absolutely. And we do have that commitment to be able to pay more if we need to. So I think yes, possibly. I don't think it's necessarily a black and white answer. Let's recognize that at the heart of this, we're talking about crime. We're talking about the worst forms of human rights violations when we talk about modern slavery. And there's a whole spectrum of conduct that comes before that in terms of labor exploitation. But really, is it acceptable to have crime in your supply chain and to be profiting off that? If you can answer that question in the affirmative, I think it's a really simple answer.
Thank you. Susan, I may ask, I think it's a really reasonable question. Do we need to acknowledge that we may need to pay more and wait longer? But what's maybe your perspective on that? How do we explain that, communicate that with stakeholders?
I think Nicole addressed that really beautifully, and I totally agree with her. I don't necessarily think it's going to lead to increased costs on products. And it's an argument that I think it's an argument that just gets raised because sometimes people don't want to take that extra step or work differently. And it's something that I hear raised a lot in relation to social Indigenous procurement as well. Like, oh, it's nice that we might purchase through them, but it's always going to cost us more. In fact, no, it doesn't necessarily cost us more. And for those companies to be viable, they need to compete in the marketplace as well, right? And so they're not necessarily necessarily going to be more expensive. It may require partnering differently and capacity building for a little while, but I don't accept the viewpoint that we have to wait longer and it's going to cost more.
There's another really good question here, which Jenny has asked both in the chat and Q&A. How can we ensure that people recognize what modern slavery looks like? We've had, a number of people talk about, child work or the worst forms of child labor or what it may look like in different countries. But how can we ensure people recognize what modern slavery looks like, whether it's construction or IT or cleaning or agriculture, not just in tier one? And I guess, how can we canvass for a hotline for Australia? I'd certainly put my hand up to support that. Justin, how can we help people recognize what it looks like?
Well, if you saw it up close, it would just look like poverty. I've taken folks on trips to meet kids in slavery, and I've even had the chance to take some famous people on trips to slavery, and they kind of get angry because they said, well, that's just poverty. And I'm like, well, what you're not seeing is this child is threatened with violence, they're economically exploited, and they're unable to walk away. So if you fit under those three, just a very simple, it might look like poverty, or it might look like kids helping their parents, or it might look like just another problem in the world. But there's a unique wrapper around that if they fall under any one of those three, so that could be migrant workers working on a construction site in Dubai, that could be construction workers or strawberry growers here in the Central Valley in California. If there's economic exploitation, they're unable to walk away, the taking away of passports, it's not a very complex description. It just doesn't advertise itself as slavery. I think that's the number one thing to understand is no one, and at least most of the people that I've met didn't even know the term slavery. No one would go, oh, by the way, my name's Ebenezer and I'm in slavery. They wouldn't have seen that. They just sleep their lives out.
Yeah. We are going to need to draw this webinar to a close. We've got 5 or 6 minutes left. Yes, in answer to one of the questions, yes, the recording will be made available after the event. And that link will be sent around and on places like the Supply Chain Sustainability School. But as we wrap up, I'm going to go around each of the speakers for, I guess, 1 or 2 last pearls of wisdom. I'm going to ask them to end with maybe their top tips for, I guess, A, prioritizing risks in this space, and B, engaging both internally and externally around these issues. So prioritizing risks and engaging internally and externally. Nicole D'Souza, I'll turn to you first.
Sure, thanks. With prioritizing risk, I'd say spend is not your only criteria. The work has come before you, so look to experts who've already put the work together. Some people like the Global Slavery Index, Walk Free, the Commonwealth Government Guidance provides a whole range of resources that you can access. Make sure that you are assessing your suppliers by industry and map your supply chain to the extent that you can at least say where in the world your goods are coming from, so that you have at least a preliminary understanding of risk. And in relation to the second question, which was internal and external collaboration, was that right? Choose value-aligned partners. Choose organizations that are heading in the same direction that you are and that will help support your vision and your mission. And seek to partner with organizations that provide something complementary and different to what you can offer. So if you're from the business world, think about your possibilities of working with civil society organizations, trade unions that relate to your sector, government organizations. And, for example, high risk area in Australia, Cleaning Accountability Framework is an amazing multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together different sectors. So look at that.
Thank you. Value-aligned partners, I think, is really important. Susan, tell us a top tip or two.
So my top tips would be to establish a cross-functional working group that's looking at what the risks are. I think in big complex organisations that need to report on with a turnover of more than $100 million and need to report against this legislation, it's really easy to see you're part of the business from where you sit. But having a cross-functional group, I think, will allow you to challenge one another and learn from one another, and ensure that your approach to the reporting is not a compliance exercise, and retains the spirit of the legislation, which is around continuous improvement and actually stamping out modern slavery. So the first one is the working group. And the second one, I would very much prepare yourself, your colleagues, your management and your board for the fact that you'll probably find something at some point.
Yep.
I think modern slavery is in all of our supply chains and even in some of our direct operations. And we may not find it this year. In fact, I can say hand on heart that, for our first annual report, for our first modern slavery report that we're about to release for Australia Post, we haven't found any clear evidence of it in this past year. But I'm confident of the fact that at some point in time in the future, it will arise. And I think you need to prepare everybody for that fact.
Thank you. Nicole Thompson, tell us a top tip or two as we close.
I think top tip for prioritisation, spend latent risk, definitely important, but as you figure out where to prioritise in the next year or so, find a few key suppliers that you can work with. And so in terms of top tip for external partnerships is really work with those suppliers and share your knowledge on risk. If you've done a risk assessment, share it with your suppliers. The more you can share knowledge, build a trusted relationship rather than a transactional one, the more progress you make. So share your knowledge, share your risk, don't do it alone.
Thank you. And Justin, tell us a top tip or two on which to close.
Yeah, you can't manage what you can't measure. So don't try to manage something if you don't understand it. You need to analyze risk. You need to get an understanding of where it is so that you can start to manage risk deeper in a supply chain. So that would be the first one. Mm-hmm. And the second one is don't waste a crisis. The world it's not just the pandemic. There's a lot going on, obviously, for me sitting in America. Systemic injustice is something that I think we all think with it in some level. We would all jump up and stand up against Nazis and walk with King. In some cases, this is our opportunity to bring the whole of ourselves, which also includes our professional selves, into the arena of systemic injustice. And supply chains are systems that have injustice embedded into the commercial relationships. Yeah. And this is your opportunity and invitation to step inside of systemic injustice and start to create systems of justice.
Thank you. That's really great words. I think as for me, I'll simply reiterate that partnership is the new leadership. We need to look at who we can work with and align with people with the same values. But also, I'm be really clear about this. Human rights and modern slavery should be a non-compete space. This is one in which we are working with our staff and suppliers and subcontractors, and we are collaborating as much as we can to make sure that everyone follows that continuous improvement line. So as we close the webinar, once again, many thanks to each of our speakers, Nicole Thompson from Edge Environment, Susan Mizrahi from Australia Post, Justin Dillon from Freedom, and Nicole D'Souza from Konica Minolta, Australia. And a big thank you to Edge Environment, of course, for providing the ticketing and recording capabilities. Please, everyone, look out for the recording of this webinar on different websites. We look forward to you joining future discussions. My name is Robin Mellon. It's been a pleasure leading this conversation on prioritizing your modern slavery risks. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for all the attendees. Stay safe, stay well, and thank you all.